To understand the absolute catastrophe that was unfolding in the dense jungles of Phuoc Tuy province in March of 1969, one must first grasp the colossal arrogance of the American military machine. This impending disaster was not born from the simple mistake of a single field officer, but rather from a fundamental collision of two entirely incompatible philosophies of warfare that were destined to end in absolute tragedy. The American military commanders were entirely convinced that their modern technological superiority would effortlessly crush any primitive resistance they encountered in the dense tropical environment. The American tactical doctrine of the 1960s stood firmly upon three unshakable pillars: overwhelming artillery firepower, maximum troop mobility achieved through fleets of helicopters, and an absolute reliance on technological superiority. The Pentagon had carefully designed a standard operating protocol that appeared simple, brutal, and highly efficient on official paper. When a standard patrol made contact with the enemy, they were instructed to immediately retreat to a safe distance, call in heavy air support, and incinerate the entire designated grid square with massive amounts of napalm and devastating heavy artillery fire. This aggressive system had worked perfectly during the Korean War against conventional regular armies, and the confident generals stationed in Washington were absolutely convinced it would effectively crush any armed resistance in Vietnam. However, the elusive enemy had already completely rewritten the fundamental rules of the deadly game, while the Americans were still strictly reading from their outdated operational manuals. The cunning Viet Cong commanders knew the standard American military playbook entirely by heart and had rapidly developed a terrifying, highly effective counter doctrine they chillingly referred to as grabbing them by the belt buckle. The enemy's strategy was brilliantly simple to the point of absolute tactical genius in the claustrophobic jungle environment. When the American soldiers predictably opened fire, the hardened Viet Cong fighters would not tactically retreat as expected, but instead would fearlessly charge directly at the opposing defensive lines. They would rapidly close the deadly distance to 20 meters, then 15, and finally to a terrifying 10 meters, effectively hugging the American frontline positions. At such a dangerously close combat range, the highly vaunted American air power was rendered completely useless by the immediate proximity. American combat pilots simply could not drop their explosive payloads without instantly eliminating their own friendly ground troops. In this chaotic, horrifying close-quarters combat environment, expensive modern technology meant absolutely nothing, and sheer numerical superiority ruthlessly determined exactly who survived the bloody day. The grim combat statistics arriving directly from the frontline engagements painted an incredibly dark picture that the panicked Pentagon desperately attempted to hide from the increasingly skeptical American public. By 1967, the devastating casualty rate for standard American military units in these close contact engagements had shockingly skyrocketed by 40%. The heavily armed enemy forces had successfully learned to completely neutralize the single greatest tactical advantage of the United States Army, brilliantly turning their heavy reliance on massive aerial support into a fatal strategic weakness. However, this devastating tactical failure was unfortunately only half of the terrifying nightmare currently facing the high command. The second, and perhaps far more intensely humiliating aspect of this growing military problem, was that the heavily equipped American forces physically could not even locate the phantom enemy they were officially supposed to be actively fighting in the region. The elite 274th Regiment of the Viet Cong, a hardened unit numbering more than 1,000 highly experienced guerrilla fighters, had been operating deep within the Phuoc Tuy province for 2 full years with almost total impunity. American military intelligence knew for an absolute fact that this massive enemy regiment actively existed. They knew the approximate geographical area of their hidden base, and they even knew the actual name of their commanding officer. Yet, every single time standard American patrols went out on aggressive search and destroy missions, they returned with absolutely nothing but total exhaustion. The dense triple canopy of jungle foliage efficiently blocked out the natural sunlight, creating a perpetual disorienting twilight that easily hid entire mobilized armies from the advanced aerial surveillance. A highly sophisticated, expansive system of underground tunnels allowed the enemy forces to quietly move underground for several kilometers, appearing and disappearing rapidly like dangerous phantoms. All the incredibly expensive American military technology, including advanced thermal imagers, sensitive motion sensors, and sophisticated chemical detectors, proved to be utterly useless in this incredibly primitive, unforgiving hell of twisted vines, venomous snakes, and damp, rotting vegetation. It was precisely for this specific reason that the increasingly desperate command of the Free World Forces made a highly unusual tactical decision and finally decided to officially call in the Australian military forces. They absolutely did not turn to this specific contingent from the land down under because they genuinely believed in their unconventional methods, but simply because every other standard operational method had already failed miserably. Within this relatively modest foreign force existed a highly secretive unit about which deeply strange and incredibly unsettling rumors were currently circulating among the bewildered conventional troops. This elite unit was the Special Air Service Regiment, or SASR, specifically adapted for conducting incredibly brutal close-range jungle warfare operations. The deeply classified official combat statistics, which the embarrassed Pentagon would deliberately keep strictly hidden for several decades, were nothing short of completely shocking to the traditional military command. During their operational deployments, the ratio of confirmed enemy losses to Australian combat losses was absolutely staggering. For every single Australian soldier tragically lost in combat, they successfully eliminated between 50 and 70 highly trained enemy combatants without heavily relying on massive tactical air support. American military command was incredibly desperate to finally understand exactly how these foreign soldiers consistently achieved these seemingly impossible combat results in such a deeply hostile environment. Major Richard Coleman, a highly decorated, perfectly polished graduate of the prestigious West Point Military Academy, was officially dispatched with a very specific, direct order to deeply investigate and uncover this tactical mystery. He fully expected to discover highly advanced, classified tracking technology, or perhaps brilliantly designed strategic operational maps hidden within their command tents. Instead, his traditional military worldview was about to be completely and violently shattered. What Major Coleman actually witnessed upon his initial arrival at the Nui Dat Forward Operating Base did not just solidify his professional skepticism, it rapidly strengthened it into an absolute conviction that he was dealing with a disorganized circus. To the intensely elite American major, these foreign soldiers were a complete walking disgrace to the noble military profession. In his highly critical eyes, they genuinely smelled like rotting garbage. To him, their heavily modified uniforms looked like completely dirty, discarded rags, and their primary combat weapons suspiciously resembled random piles of absolute trash. When this meticulously groomed officer first laid his critical eyes on these specific enlisted men, he barely managed to forcefully hold back a sudden physical gag reflex caused by their overwhelming stench. He quickly pulled out his official notepad and angrily wrote down just one single descriptive word to summarize his entire professional assessment: amateurs. But the highly educated major was completely and utterly wrong in his arrogant initial judgment. This proud West Point graduate had absolutely no rational idea that standing right in front of him were the absolute most dangerous predators alive. He possessed absolutely no clue that what he arrogantly called an unbearable, nauseating stench was actually the precise scientific weapon that would soon miraculously save his own life. Major Coleman remained entirely unaware that within just 72 incredibly violent hours, these so-called filthy, undisciplined ragtags would forcefully make him burn with intense professional shame. They were about to completely rewrite the entire established history of global special forces operations forever. Would you firmly believe that these 5 specific men managed to completely humiliate the multi-billion-dollar American war machine using nothing but perfectly ordinary fermented fish sauce? The Australian soldiers were currently in the final, critical stages of diligently preparing for a classified combat mission, but their bizarre preparation visually looked far more like a ridiculous theater of the absurd. Sergeant Terry O'Brien was absolutely not formally inspecting the pristine polish on their standard leather combat boots or the sharp, neat creases in their pressed military uniforms. Instead, the seasoned veteran was casually walking down the quiet line of his rugged men, rigorously checking their strict compliance with a deeply strange, highly classified protocol known internally as unorthodox. However, this strange procedure had absolutely nothing to do with officially removing dangerous weapons or safely securing the active perimeter area. It was actually about a highly radical, completely biological transformation that would effectively render the deployed soldiers completely invisible to the absolute most dangerous, highly sensitive sensors hidden deep in the perilous jungle. The incredibly grotesque scene that slowly unfolded right before the totally bewildered American officer fundamentally involved a strict, uncompromising ban on all standard, modern Western hygiene products exactly 3 full days before their scheduled combat deployment. There was absolutely no fragrant chemical soap, no scented modern shampoo, no artificial spray deodorant, and definitely no standard commercial shaving cream officially allowed within this elite unit. But this intensive preparation genuinely went far deeper than simply practicing basic abstinence from standard military cleanliness. The focused men were actively and thoroughly coating their deeply tanned, exposed skin and worn combat uniforms with a truly nauseating, thick paste deliberately created from dark river mud, crushed rotting jungle leaves, and a very generous amount of locally fermented fish sauce. To Major Coleman, this incredibly primitive, foul-smelling ritual looked exactly like the savage practices of an ancient, forgotten indigenous tribe entirely lost in time, smelling completely like literal death itself. He barely suppressed a highly condescending laugh as he arrogantly asked Sergeant O'Brien exactly why his supposedly elite combat unit was currently playing in the wet mud like completely undisciplined young children. The immediate answer he firmly received from the veteran was chillingly calm, highly calculated, and utterly devastating to his heavily inflated, traditional American professional military ego. Sergeant O'Brien patiently explained to the skeptical major that the sensitive human nose is an incredibly powerful evolutionary survival tool, and the veteran Viet Cong trackers were absolute masters of efficiently using it. He accurately pointed out that heavily equipped American soldiers were literally walking biological beacons, loudly broadcasting a massive amount of highly unnatural olfactory information. The standard-issue commercial soap, proudly used by the entire United States Army, constantly emitted a very distinct, extremely sharp chemical floral scent that absolutely did not naturally exist anywhere within the jungle. Even the highly popular American cigarettes, specifically the heavily manufactured Marlboros, constantly burned with a distinctively sweet, heavily toasted tobacco aroma that was completely chemically different from the incredibly harsh, highly acrid smoke of the common local tobacco. Furthermore, O'Brien scientifically explained that any large soldier who daily consumes a massive military diet heavily rich in processed red meat, refined industrial sugar, and heavy dairy products ultimately produces human sweat with a completely different biological chemical composition than a local guerrilla who permanently survives strictly on plain rice and local greens. To a highly skilled enemy tracker, silently hiding patiently in the dense surrounding bush over 300 meters away, a standard massive American combat patrol genuinely screamed its exact physical presence right through the shifting wind, long before it ever physically came into visual view. Major Coleman diligently wrote down this incredibly strange biological explanation in his official leather notebook, but his highly skeptical facial expression immediately betrayed his deeply dismissive private thoughts. He firmly marked the entire disgusting procedure as utterly pointless nonsense, driven by superstitious local field myths. The deeply arrogant major remained absolutely convinced that the true operational secret of these highly lethal Australians simply had to be cleverly hidden in some highly classified, deeply expensive tracking technology or incredibly superior radio interception gear. The completely absurd idea that the single most powerful, technologically advanced modern military in recorded human history was actively losing this incredibly brutal, massively expensive war simply because of the floral smell of standard commercial bath soap sounded exactly like a ridiculous, entirely fictional campfire fairy tale, specifically invented to deeply scare naive young recruits. However, the relentless, deeply humiliating assault on his highly traditional, officially sanctioned conventional military wisdom was genuinely only just beginning to truly unfold right before his very eyes. The next massive professional shock forcefully arrived when Major Coleman critically turned his intense, highly analytical attention to the actual physical combat equipment the Australian soldiers were currently carrying, or far more accurately, the massive amount of standard military equipment they had deliberately chosen to completely leave entirely behind at the incredibly safe, highly fortified forward military operating base. A standard American Special Forces patrol typically geared up heavily for a standard combat mission exactly as if they were confidently going to wage a massive, conventional mechanized war against the entire heavily armed world. An average American soldier would routinely be incredibly loaded down with a fully automatic rifle, A heavy steel sidearm securely placed in a stiff leather hip holster, multiple heavy fragmentation grenades loudly clipped to his metal belt, brightly colored smoke canisters, massive defensive mines, countless extra metal magazines, and a massively heavy tactical communication radio. The total physical weight of this massively heavy, officially mandated standard combat loadout quite often easily reached an incredibly staggering 40 to 50 heavy kilograms per individual fighting man. The rugged Australians, standing directly in extremely stark, highly visible physical contrast to the heavy Americans, literally looked exactly as if they were casually going for a highly relaxing, incredibly light afternoon hike through a perfectly peaceful local city park. Their core tactical operational philosophy regarding deployed combat equipment was intensely radical, incredibly ruthless, and highly focused entirely on extreme physical mobility. Every single extra gram of totally unnecessary tactical equipment was ruthlessly deemed a massive, potentially fatal operational liability out in the unforgiving bush. Instead of utilizing the standard American automatic rifles, many of these highly unconventional men purposefully carried heavily modified, violently sawed-off self-loading combat rifles. They had rapidly and efficiently stripped away every single non-essential metal part from their primary weapons. Heavy metal flash suppressors were entirely removed, and convenient top-carrying handles were violently sawn completely off to effectively prevent them from accidentally snagging directly on any dense vines. They absolutely refused to ever use standard military metal canteens simply because drinking water constantly sloshing heavily inside a hard metal container reliably makes a highly distinct, incredibly unnatural metallic clinking sound that easily travels for several miles in the otherwise completely silent tropical jungle. Furthermore, while the heavy Americans always wore thick leather combat boots, specifically designed to keep their feet perfectly dry, the rugged Australians actually took sharp combat knives directly to their official footwear, deliberately cutting massive open ventilation slits right into the sides of their boots. The underlying tactical logic was entirely counterintuitive to the highly trained American major, yet it was absolutely brilliantly effective in this harsh reality. In the intensely swampy, permanently flooded local terrain, heavily marching soldiers' feet were inevitably going to get completely soaking wet, absolutely no matter what high-tech gear they used. Standard waterproof boots simply trapped the putrid swamp water permanently inside, rapidly turning healthy human feet into rotting, intensely painful masses of highly dangerous fungal infections and extremely crippling trench foot that completely destroyed their essential mobility. Sergeant O'Brien keenly noticed the highly skeptical, deeply judgmental look Major Coleman was openly giving their heavily modified, incredibly cheap-looking tactical field appearance. O'Brien confidently permitted himself the only tiny smile of the entire long day and casually offered the proud major an incredibly simple, highly practical field experiment right there in the camp. He boldly challenged Major Coleman to proudly walk just 100 short meters directly through the quiet camp perimeter at a completely normal, casual walking pace, securely wearing his standard American heavy field tactical gear. Coleman confidently accepted the highly unusual challenge immediately. Feeling absolutely secure in his highly trained, official military ability to smoothly move extremely quietly across the dry ground, he steadily began to walk forward, placing his heavy booted feet incredibly carefully, moving extremely slowly and deliberately. However, the proud major had not even successfully covered 30 short meters when the veteran Australian sergeant suddenly raised his weathered hand high and loudly told him to stop completely. The quietly observing Australians quickly turned around, completely unfazed by the major's best stealthy effort. O'Brien calmly listed the highly embarrassing, completely undeniable factual results of the short walking test directly to the totally stunned American combat officer. The highly attentive Australian soldiers had accurately counted exactly 27, entirely separate, deeply distinct, highly unnatural mechanical sounds, heavily emanating from the carefully moving major. They clearly heard the heavy metal buckle of his tight webbing loudly scraping directly against his metal rifle, the rhythmic, incredibly loud swishing noise of his stiff nylon tactical trousers loudly rubbing together, and the heavy thudding of his issued tactical combat boots. O'Brien chillingly explained the incredibly cold, deeply harsh biological reality currently waiting for them in the absolute dead silence of the dark jungle night. 27 distinct mechanical sounds were absolutely not just harmless background noise. They genuinely represented a completely unavoidable, highly violent death sentence for everyone. A highly trained Viet Cong sentry could easily and accurately identify that incredibly specific mechanical noise signature from well over 150 meters away. The elite Australians only survived out there simply because they carried absolutely nothing that could possibly rattle. This was the precise, terrifying exact moment when the massive, previously ironclad professional confidence of Major Coleman officially began to deeply crack. But the absolute most terrifying, highly effective strategic weapon currently existing within the entire Australian arsenal was incredibly not a modified piece of physical equipment at all. It was actually a quiet, deeply intense living man whose name was Billy Nungara, a highly gifted, completely supernatural indigenous tracker originally from the extremely remote, deeply harsh central deserts of the vast Australian outback, possessing truly impossible sensory abilities. Major Coleman watched in absolutely stunned, deeply terrified silence as the incredible Aboriginal tracker smoothly moved along a completely hidden practice trail with his dark eyes heavily half-closed. He wasn't just casually looking directly at the disturbed ground. He was physically feeling it deeply with his entire soul. Every few meters he would suddenly stop, actively flare his nostrils exactly like a highly trained hunting dog, and softly press his bare, deeply calloused palm directly against the damp earth to silently read the heavily hidden, microscopic physical environmental changes. Nungara accurately predicted the exact number, specific physical injuries, and precise directional movement of incredibly stealthy targets hours after they vanished. The incredibly humbled Major finally realized, with absolute bone-chilling horror, that he was genuinely standing in the terrifying presence of apex biological predators who flawlessly played by highly ancient, lethal rules the massive Pentagon did not even know existed. But the absolute ultimate test was about to violently begin, as the squad surprisingly received a completely suicidal tactical order to actively march directly into a massive, thousand-strong enemy encampment. This seemingly impossible, highly classified tactical directive officially ordered these 5 incredibly filthy, lightly armed men to deliberately walk straight into the highly fortified, incredibly deadly beating heart of an entire elite enemy regiment. They would bravely deploy with absolutely zero heavy armored backup, no immediate aerial extraction capability, and absolutely no realistic chance of conventional survival if they were unfortunately discovered in the dense bush. The heart-stopping, incredibly tense reality of this entirely unprecedented, utterly suicidal combat deployment was about to completely shatter Major Coleman's fragile sanity. 2 agonizing days later, the purely theoretical phase of the operation abruptly ended, and the terrifying physical nightmare finally began in earnest. Patrol Sierra 2, confidently led by the highly experienced Sergeant O'Brien, officially received its incredibly dangerous, deeply classified combat orders. The primary tactical mission was deceptively simple on standard military paper: locate the heavily fortified forward base of the highly elusive enemy regiment and silently transmit the exact coordinates. However, their completely unconventional operational plan intensely defied every single established rule of standard American military logic. A traditional American infantry commander would have aggressively planned this specific reconnaissance operation using overwhelming mechanical force and incredible speed. The standard tactical textbook dictated a massive, highly visible helicopter assault, an incredibly rapid search of the immediate local area, and a heavily armed, immediate tactical extraction. The primary strategic goal would strictly be to efficiently get in and get out before the local enemy forces could adequately react. The Australian operational plan, however, deliberately intended to keep the exposed patrol entirely alone in the deep jungle for 10 full days. These highly trained, incredibly focused men would silently infiltrate 40 kilometers incredibly deep into entirely hostile, heavily fortified enemy territory. They would operate completely beyond the maximum functional range of any quick emergency aerial extraction or standard heavy armored backup. Their designated helicopter drop zone was deliberately and brilliantly chosen a full 20 kilometers entirely away from their actual target area. This highly calculated tactical deception firmly ensured the vigilant enemy forces would absolutely never intellectually connect the distant mechanical sound of a hovering chopper with their actual operational destination. When the incredibly stressed Major Coleman frantically reviewed the highly detailed operational map, he genuinely thought he was analyzing an elaborate suicide note. 5 lightly armed men, carrying absolutely no heavy tactical support weapons, were casually going to walk directly into the highly fortified backyard of 1,000 heavily armed enemy combatants. The deeply concerned American officer passionately argued with the Australian squadron commander, firmly insisting that this bizarre plan was not standard tactical reconnaissance, but an absolute undeniable death sentence for the entirely exposed, highly vulnerable small infantry patrol. The deeply weathered Australian commander calmly looked directly at the intensely panicked American officer with a highly penetrating gaze that was simultaneously incredibly weary and deeply pitying. The veteran casually replied with a single, incredibly profound sentence that would permanently haunt Major Coleman for the absolute rest of his natural life. He chillingly stated that while heavy American forces essentially spend all their incredibly valuable time aggressively hunting for the elusive enemy, the patient Australians have successfully learned it is ultimately much more effective to simply let the enemy actively find them. The initial 3 agonizing days of the highly classified operation passed incredibly slowly in an absolute, deeply terrifying silence that was practically deafening to human ears. O'Brien's heavily camouflaged patrol silently moved through the dense tropical jungle at an incredibly slow, highly deliberate physical pace that would have seemed completely agonizing to any standard military observer. They successfully covered barely 3 short kilometers every single day, deliberately choosing to carefully move forward only under the incredibly heavy, completely pitch-black cover of the incredibly dense, highly restrictive local nocturnal darkness. The highly focused men would silently creep stealthily forward for a highly disciplined maximum of 15 to 20 short minutes. Then, they would absolutely freeze their exhausted bodies completely solid for an entire agonizing hour, just to actively listen to the incredibly subtle, highly complex natural breathing of the deep surrounding forest. During the extremely dangerous daylight hours, the completely silent patrol lay absolutely motionless deep inside tiny, carefully constructed defensive foxholes. These small, highly natural depressions in the damp ground were painstakingly camouflaged using completely indigenous, freshly cut local tropical vegetation. Critical tactical radio contact with the distant forward operating base was incredibly strictly kept to an absolute, heavily disciplined minimum to avoid deadly detection. They authorized just 2 incredibly short, highly compressed bursts of coded radio static strictly every 24 agonizing hours, simply to officially confirm the small team was genuinely still physically alive. So far, the highly complex, deeply dangerous infiltration phase was proceeding exactly according to their incredibly meticulous, highly unconventional tactical plan. The highly visible, incredibly fresh physical signs of the massive enemy force were absolutely everywhere around them. The highly observant patrol successfully found recently abandoned, heavily concealed campfires, sharply cut tropical vines, and extremely well-worn muddy trails. These incredibly dangerous jungle paths were heavily marked by the entirely distinctive, easily recognizable physical tread of standard enemy military combat sandals. The incredibly tense, highly psychological game of deadly biological hide-and-seek was completely exhausting, thoroughly pushing the resilient men directly to the absolute very limits of their physical endurance. But exactly on the deeply fateful 4th day, the previously slow, highly methodical operational game completely and violently changed forever. The incredibly gifted Aboriginal tracker, Billy Nungara, suddenly stopped completely dead in his careful tracks and urgently pointed silently to the ground. He had miraculously spotted a tiny, incredibly subtle patch of deeply disturbed, damp earth that remained completely invisible to every single other highly trained man. The newly discovered track was incredibly fresh, definitively made less than 6 short hours ago, but the specific, highly elusive person who had carefully made it was deliberately moving incredibly strangely. The highly skilled enemy soldier was actually cleverly walking completely backward along the path. This incredibly cunning enemy was purposefully placing his bare heel down first to cleverly create the brilliant optical illusion that he was actively moving in the completely opposite geographical direction. The deeply experienced Australians instantly realized the incredibly grim, highly terrifying truth of their highly precarious current tactical situation. This was absolutely not a clumsy local peasant or a heavily lost, highly disoriented enemy conscript wandering aimlessly. This was a highly trained, deeply professional veteran enemy tracker actively hunting them. The incredibly stealthy biological hunters had just officially become the highly vulnerable hunted. Sergeant O'Brien almost immediately made a highly controversial tactical decision that the incredibly traditional Major Coleman would have easily and completely classified as pure, unadulterated operational insanity. Instead of immediately initiating a rapid tactical retreat or frantically calling the distant command post for a heavily armed emergency aerial extraction, the incredibly calm veteran purposely ordered his highly exposed patrol to actually continue moving incredibly deeper into the heavily fortified enemy territory. But now, the highly experienced sergeant quietly issued a highly terrifying, entirely new tactical operational order to his incredibly focused, highly disciplined men. The deeply shocking new command was incredibly simple yet utterly terrifying. Deliberately leave highly subtle physical traces for the highly skilled enemy to actually find. He absolutely did not want incredibly clumsy, totally obvious physical signs that would immediately look exactly like a poorly constructed, highly amateurish tactical ambush. He demanded incredibly subtle, barely perceptible physical imperfections specifically designed to thoroughly manipulate the highly observant enemy. A tiny broken twig completely snapped right here. A very slightly crushed small patch of wet grass, placed deliberately right over there. It was highly calculated psychological warfare. The highly exposed Australian patrol was now deliberately and incredibly carefully transforming its own highly vulnerable physical presence directly from the stealthy hunter into the incredibly exposed tactical bait. But this was absolutely no ordinary highly standard military trap currently being carefully set deep in the unforgiving jungle. It was the highly dangerous, completely foundational setup for an incredibly lethal, highly complex tactical ambush entirely reliant on extreme precision. The highly audacious, completely insane plan was to actively allow the highly skilled enemy to successfully track them directly to a very specific geographical location. They intended to effectively lure the highly aggressive pursuing enemy force deeply into a pre-selected, highly specific geographical kill zone. Once the massive enemy formation was completely trapped inside the tiny perimeter, they would rapidly unleash an incredibly intense, highly concentrated heavy artillery barrage so deeply devastating that absolutely nothing biological inside the specific zone could possibly survive. However, the absolutely terrifying, highly critical problem was that the physically nearest friendly heavy artillery battery was currently sitting exactly 30 kilometers entirely away directly through the incredibly dense, completely impenetrable tropical vegetation. The incredibly risky, highly complex tactical trap required an absolute, completely unwavering blind trust that deeply terrified standard conventional military thinking. The 5 entirely exposed men patiently lying directly in the deep, freezing mud literally had to firmly believe that a highly distant artillery gunner successfully operating 30 entire kilometers away absolutely wouldn't accidentally sneeze while carefully aiming the heavy weapon. While the incredibly deadly trap was now perfectly set, the incredibly tense team first had to successfully physically survive a highly concentrated moment of absolute, heart-stopping, purely biological, psychological terror. On the incredibly tense 5th day, while the highly exhausted patrol lay completely frozen deep within their highly camouflaged daytime hide positions, absolute disaster struck. A highly trained, incredibly stealthy enemy advanced scout suddenly emerged completely silently, directly from the incredibly dense surrounding tropical undergrowth. This highly observant soldier was an integral, highly active part of the massive advanced tracking team efficiently moving well ahead of the extremely large main assault force. The deeply experienced enemy scout carefully walked incredibly slowly, meticulously scanning every single wet leaf and highly suspicious dark shadow. The deeply focused enemy combatant suddenly stopped completely dead, less than one single agonizing meter directly from exactly where the highly hidden Sergeant O'Brien patiently lay. The entirely motionless Australian veteran was heavily buried directly under a thick, carefully constructed layer of rotting jungle leaves and wet dark mud. The deeply suspicious enemy soldier carefully looked directly down, his dirty local sandal practically touching the very edge of the incredibly tense Australian's meticulously crafted organic camouflage. The air itself completely froze as absolute death silently hovered directly above the buried man. Then, the highly alert enemy scout suddenly did exactly something that violently made O'Brien's pumping blood run absolutely completely cold inside his frozen veins. The deeply suspicious soldier forcefully flared his wide nostrils heavily and deeply sniffed the entirely still, incredibly damp jungle air directly above the hidden man. This agonizingly slow, highly terrifying second was the absolute, completely undeniable moment of total truth. For the incredibly bizarre, highly disgusting biological disarming ritual, the utterly confused American major had so arrogantly and completely mocked back at the highly secure distant base. If the heavily sweating Sergeant O'Brien had foolishly used one single tiny drop of standard, highly scented commercial American bath soap, he would die. If he had secretly eaten a tiny piece of processed chocolate, or if he had carelessly smoked a highly pungent commercial cigarette in the entire last week, he would definitely be violently shot, completely dead in the absolute very next terrifying second. The highly alert enemy scout quickly took an incredibly deep breath, actively searching strictly for the highly unnatural chemical scent of a modern foreign military invader. But absolutely all the incredibly focused enemy scout actually smelled was the entirely natural damp rot of the deeply ancient jungle floor. He completely inhaled the faint, highly pungent odor of heavily fermented fish sauce, a deeply natural biological smell exactly as highly common to the local environment as the heavy tropical rain itself. Entirely satisfied that he was completely alone in the dense bush, the highly trained scout slowly turned entirely around and quietly melted completely back directly into the incredibly deep, highly protective dark shadows of the silent trees. The incredibly shaken Australian veteran patiently lay completely motionless exactly there for another entire agonizing hour, heavily stinging salty sweat pouring profusely into his unblinking eyes. He was completely unable to safely blink, his rapidly hammering heart violently pounding heavily against his highly bruised ribs exactly like a deeply terrified, completely trapped small bird. The highly disgusting, incredibly pungent, fermented local fish sauce had genuinely just miraculously successfully saved his entire life from total destruction. But the incredibly profound physical danger was genuinely absolutely incredibly far from being entirely over yet. The highly brilliant, incredibly dangerous tactical bait had genuinely worked absolutely entirely too well for their incredibly vulnerable, deeply precarious defensive situation. By the terrifyingly early morning of the highly stressful sixth day, the incredibly elaborate tactical ambush trap was finally, completely, fully set. The extremely small patrol had carefully dug deeply into a heavily concealed, slightly elevated defensive position directly on a tiny small hill. However, the deeply terrifying, absolutely shocking reality was that an incredibly massive reinforced enemy company was currently rapidly closing the highly lethal tactical perimeter tight, numbering well over 120 incredibly heavily armed, highly motivated enemy men. The massive assault force was aggressively moving swiftly to completely encircle the tiny hill. They were actively coming to absolutely completely crush the incredibly tiny force of just 5 lightly armed Australian soldiers who possessed absolutely nowhere left to hide. As the highly experienced enemy commander confidently raised his deadly whistle to officially launch the absolutely final, heavily concentrated massive frontal assault, a completely unexpected, entirely catastrophic technological failure was about to violently seal their incredibly grim doom. The deeply terrifying, highly anticipated morning of the sixth day brought an incredibly chilling reality to the completely exhausted Australian patrol. From their highly fortified, completely camouflaged defensive positions, located high on the tiny hill in Sector Charlie 7 Bravo, the heavily outnumbered men could clearly see the massive enemy buildup. Over 120 heavily armed, highly motivated Viet Cong soldiers were actively maneuvering through the dense surrounding foliage. They were aggressively establishing a highly lethal, completely inescapable defensive perimeter entirely designed to violently crush the highly exposed, incredibly vulnerable 5-man reconnaissance team. The highly experienced Australian sergeant calmly watched the incredibly disciplined enemy assault force methodically deploying directly through the narrow natural gaps in the dense tropical vegetation. He clearly saw 2 full, heavily armed infantry platoons aggressively forming up for a massive, highly concentrated frontal assault directly against their tiny defensive position. Meanwhile, a third highly mobile enemy element was rapidly moving to quickly flank their extremely vulnerable sides. A massively heavy, incredibly dangerous enemy machine gun team was also actively setting up their lethal equipment to completely suppress the tiny, highly exposed Australian defensive perimeter. The completely terrifying, highly disproportionate tactical odds were officially set at an absolutely staggering 120 aggressive enemy fighters against just 5 lightly armed men. Right as the highly confident enemy commander violently raised his loud wooden whistle to officially signal the absolute final, completely overwhelming frontal assault, a completely catastrophic, entirely unexpected technological disaster suddenly struck. The highly critical tactical communication radio, the absolutely single most important piece of vital survival equipment the small patrol possessed, abruptly and completely died right at the worst possible moment. The incredibly intense tropical humidity had apparently heavily corroded the delicate metal electrical contacts, or perhaps the heavy internal battery had simply tragically failed exactly at the absolute most critical, highly dangerous tactical moment imaginable. With the heavily armed, highly aggressive enemy force, literally less than 200 short meters away and rapidly closing the tight noose, the deeply terrified Australians were entirely cut off. They were completely disconnected from the highly distant heavy artillery support, the absolute only viable tactical weapon that could genuinely save them from a highly brutal, completely violent, immediate death. A massive, highly understandable wave of deep, completely paralyzing human panic immediately began to rapidly rise directly in the completely terrified young radio operator's wide eyes. However, the highly trained, incredibly disciplined soldier violently fought the overwhelming fear completely down into his tight chest. With incredibly trembling, highly frantic, sweaty hands, he desperately pulled out his sharp metal combat knife and immediately began to aggressively scrape the heavily corroded internal battery terminals. He desperately prayed to absolute higher powers that he wouldn't accidentally break the incredibly delicate, highly fragile internal metal connection pieces entirely, outside their tiny, incredibly shallow defensive foxholes. The absolute first terrifying cracks of highly lethal, extremely close enemy rifle fire violently ripped right through the incredibly damp, entirely still morning air. The desperately terrified radio man worked incredibly feverishly inside the dirt hole, tiny orange sparks violently flying around as he desperately tried to physically reconnect the critical electrical power supply. Suddenly, an incredibly beautiful, highly comforting burst of loud white static violently hissed directly into his molded tactical earpiece. They were finally back online, possessing immediate contact with the distant base. But there was absolutely no valuable time left to happily celebrate the miraculous technological recovery, because the highly aggressive enemy forces had definitively launched their massive, entirely overwhelming coordinated infantry attack. The deeply experienced Viet Cong field commander, a highly hardened combat veteran who intimately knew Australian defensive tactics, boldly decided to completely skip the standard cautious probing attacks. He decisively ordered a massive, incredibly devastating direct blow instead. Heavy, incredibly lethal enemy machine gun fire violently erupted, rapidly shredding the thick tropical vegetation completely apart directly above the heavily pinned Australian soldiers. Then, the incredibly loud, highly piercing sound of the tactical assault whistle violently blew, and a massive, entirely terrifying wave of gray-clad enemy combatants aggressively surged completely forward. When the incredibly fast, highly motivated, absolute first line of heavily armed enemy attackers violently hit the highly critical 50-meter defensive mark, the entire surrounding jungle world completely and violently exploded. The highly disciplined Australian defenders simultaneously triggered their heavily concealed, incredibly deadly Claymore directional explosive mines. 20 massive detonations violently ripped right through the incredibly dense surrounding tropical jungle entirely at the exact same moment. Thousands of incredibly lethal, highly accelerated heavy steel ball bearings violently tore directly through the entirely exposed front rank of the aggressively charging enemy infantry formation. It was an absolute, completely horrific tactical massacre, rapidly turning the charging men into a highly bloody mess. But it tragically only bought the highly outnumbered Australian defenders a few incredibly short, completely agonizing seconds. The highly resilient, deeply furious enemy survivors quickly regrouped directly over the bleeding bodies of their fallen comrades and immediately charged forward again, screaming incredibly loudly as they violently ran toward the hill. The highly terrifying tactical distance violently closed to an incredibly deadly 40 meters, then rapidly dropped to an absolute heart-stopping 30 short meters. The deeply desperate Australian soldiers were frantically firing their modified combat rifles absolutely as fast as they physically could, but they were unquestionably about to be entirely and violently overrun by the sheer overwhelming massive numbers. At that absolute exact terrifying second, the frantically screaming radio man violently yelled two deeply specific, highly classified tactical coordinate words directly into the heavy plastic communication handset. He officially initiated the final trap. Exactly 30 long kilometers away to the absolute distant south, the highly legendary, incredibly precise gunners of the Royal New Zealand Artillery Battery forcefully pulled the heavy firing lanyards on their massive howitzers. The total aerodynamic flight time for a heavy, incredibly destructive high-explosive artillery shell successfully traveling at that incredibly massive geographical range is approximately 45 agonizingly slow seconds. Those specific 45 seconds genuinely represented an absolute, deeply terrifying psychological eternity for everyone involved. The highly pinned Australians huddled incredibly deeply inside their tiny, heavily reinforced dirt holes as the enemy approached. The incredibly aggressive enemy soldiers rapidly closed the deadly combat distance to completely within a terrifying 20 meters, and highly lethal explosive fragmentation grenades were actively landing violently all around the tiny defensive perimeter. And then, the entire tropical sky violently fell completely down upon the heavily contested jungle earth. The absolute first massive salvo of incredibly heavy, high-explosive artillery shells violently slammed directly into the soft ground, with the absolutely terrifying, highly unstoppable kinetic force of a massive speeding freight train landing exactly in a completely perfect, highly precise, deadly semicircle. The incredibly accurate, highly devastating heavy artillery shells landed entirely and completely flawlessly, just 50 incredibly short meters entirely away from the highly exposed Australian defensive positions. The incredibly soft jungle ground violently heaved upwards, and the absolute deafening, entirely world-shattering noise was genuinely so incredibly loud, it entirely bypassed human hearing and was violently felt entirely within the fragile bones. For the absolute next 10 incredibly terrifying, entirely earth-shattering minutes, the highly skilled New Zealand gunners actively walked their massive wall of explosive heavy fire systematically back and forth across the enemy zone. They violently churned the previously lush tropical jungle into an incredibly horrifying, entirely barren, burning wasteland of completely splintered broken wood and massively deep smoking dirt craters. Completely inside the highly terrifying, intensely burning explosive inferno, Sergeant O'Brien incredibly calmly adjusted the highly lethal fire coordinates, aggressively bringing the massive wall of absolute violent death incredibly closer and closer. The deeply terrifying, massively heavy explosions were literally and violently physically shaking the sensitive human teeth directly inside his heavily sweating, completely mud-caked head. Then, the incredibly heavy, entirely destructive steel rain finally stopped entirely. When the incredibly thick, highly toxic gray smoke finally began to slowly clear away from the heavily devastated battlefield, the absolute eerie, entirely heavy silence that immediately followed was genuinely far heavier than the previous noise. The incredibly dangerous, highly suicidal tactical gamble had absolutely and completely paid off perfectly for the small team. The once entirely lush, highly impenetrable green tropical canopy had been violently and completely shredded entirely apart, freely allowing the highly harsh natural sunlight to brightly illuminate the absolutely horrific, entirely devastating bloody tactical carnage left directly below them. The highly confident enemy infantry company that had aggressively charged directly up the steep jungle slope simply completely ceased to actually exist entirely as a functional fighting military unit. Exactly 73 completely motionless enemy soldiers tragically lay absolutely entirely dead, exactly where the massive, highly concentrated heavy artillery steel rain had violently caught them in the open. Another 30 highly panicked, heavily bleeding enemy survivors were frantically and incredibly desperately scattering completely blindly directly back into the deeply burning, entirely devastated surrounding jungle in a totally panicked attempt to quickly escape the slaughter. The 5 lightly armed Australian soldiers, completely incredibly and almost entirely miraculously, were genuinely entirely still alive inside the devastated perimeter. They slowly emerged directly from their heavily buried dirt foxholes, entirely shaken, completely deafened, and totally heavily covered in thick dark dirt, but remarkably completely physically intact. Only one single highly incredibly lucky man had tragically sustained an entirely minor bleeding injury when a tiny jagged piece of hot flying metal shrapnel violently grazed his upper leg, But the absolute, true, highly monumental strategic victory was precisely what the bloody survivors did next. The highly focused, incredibly disciplined Australian patrol absolutely completely refused to actually loudly celebrate their truly miraculous, highly unlikely physical survival in the completely shattered, deeply burning jungle zone. Instead, the completely ruthless, highly professional military hunters simply calmly reloaded their entirely empty hot combat weapons and quietly prepared to immediately actively follow the highly obvious bloody trail. They were aggressively intending to silently shadow the entirely broken, deeply bleeding, retreating enemy survivors directly back to their incredibly secret main headquarters, setting the final, completely devastating stage for an absolutely massive historical military revelation. For 3 incredibly grueling days, the highly focused Australian patrol silently shadowed the deeply traumatized, heavily bleeding enemy survivors directly through the dense vegetation. They absolutely refused to initiate any further tactical combat engagements, preferring instead to remain completely invisible ghosts haunting the treacherous tropical landscape. The highly disciplined men meticulously followed the obvious physical signs of panic, utilizing their unparalleled tracking skills to navigate the perilous terrain. This brilliant, highly calculated tactical patience was meticulously designed to ultimately reveal the absolute greatest strategic prize of the entire long military campaign in the heavily contested region. Exactly on the highly anticipated 10th day of the grueling operation, Sergeant O'Brien finally transmitted a set of highly classified tactical coordinates that would permanently change the entire course of the brutal war in the province. The incredibly exhausted but highly triumphant patrol had successfully located the deeply hidden, entirely pristine main sanctuary base of the elusive elite enemy regiment. The highly detailed military intelligence they rapidly gathered was completely unprecedented and absolutely devastating. He accurately reported the exact geographical locations of reinforced command bunkers, hidden anti-aircraft defensive positions, and massively heavily guarded underground logistical supply depots. The completely overwhelming strategic response was incredibly swift and absolutely entirely devastating to the deeply entrenched enemy forces. Early the very following morning, a massively heavy, highly coordinated American aerial strike based entirely upon this incredibly precise intelligence completely obliterated the massive enemy headquarters facility. This incredibly destructive, highly precise tactical bombing raid effectively knocked the entire formidable enemy regiment completely out of the brutal war for many long months. The highly complex, incredibly dangerous biological tracking game had miraculously yielded a massive strategic victory that conventional American military forces had failed to achieve for 2 full years. When the loud mechanical roar of the heavy extraction helicopter finally echoed through the dense tropical canopy and touched down safely at the secure forward operating base, Major Coleman was anxiously waiting directly on the hot tarmac. The intensely curious American officer urgently needed to personally witness the miraculous return of the seemingly doomed patrol. The 5 entirely exhausted men who slowly stumbled off the hovering military chopper physically looked absolutely nothing like traditional modern soldiers. They genuinely resembled completely terrifying, deeply inhuman biological creatures, violently crawling directly out from an incredibly dark, deeply ancient tropical nightmare. Thick, deeply hardened layers of dark river mud, highly degraded natural camouflage paint, and their very own biological filth had practically formed a solid permanent crust entirely covering their deeply tanned skin. Their deeply sunken eyes were heavily red-rimmed from 10 full agonizing days of absolutely constant tactical vigilance and profound, incredibly severe sleep deprivation. Their ruined uniforms were literally tattered, dirty rags completely hanging off their heavily gaunt, starving physical frames. The intensely overpowering, deeply pungent biological smell that heavily wafted from them was a sickening, highly concentrated mix of old sweat, deep swamp rot, and fermented fish sauce. The completely nauseating biological stench was genuinely powerful enough to instantly make the hardened helicopter crew physically gag and violently turn their disgusted faces completely away. But the profoundly changed Major Coleman absolutely did not turn his focused gaze away from the returning veterans. He stood completely frozen, intensely staring at these incredibly filthy men with a profound, deeply humbling look of absolute intellectual realization. The massive institutional arrogance of West Point, the absolute operational certainty of standard military doctrine, and all his highly polished theoretical concepts of modern warfare entirely crumbled completely into absolute dust right there. He finally profoundly realized that absolutely everything he had previously been officially taught about this specific jungle war was entirely wrong. These incredibly rugged men had achieved the truly impossible, absolutely not because they possessed highly superior Western technology, but specifically because they had deliberately stripped themselves completely of it. They had miraculously survived an incredibly violent tactical situation that absolutely should have violently killed them 10 times over, specifically because they possessed the sheer insane courage to confidently call down highly explosive, heavy artillery fire directly onto their own vulnerable heads. It was a massive paradigm shift. The highly humbled American major slowly walked directly up to the incredibly filthy Sergeant O'Brien, absolutely completely ignoring the thick dark mud and the incredibly nauseating biological stench. He deeply respectfully extended his clean right hand and quietly spoke profound, entirely honest words that would tragically never officially appear inside his highly classified military report. He openly admitted directly to the exhausted veteran that he had been an absolute arrogant fool, completely confessing that incorrectly calling them undisciplined amateurs was the single absolute biggest professional mistake of his entire long military career. Genuinely asking the rugged sergeant for forgiveness, Sergeant O'Brien calmly looked deeply at the incredibly clean, perfectly pressed military uniform of the highly educated American officer, and then slowly looked directly down at his own incredibly filthy, entirely mud-caked hand. The exhausted Australian veteran absolutely did not smile triumphantly, nor did he arrogantly gloat over the profound intellectual victory. He simply respectfully nodded his dirty head, firmly shook the deeply apologetic major's hand, and slowly walked quietly toward the base showers. Exactly 3 short days later, this incredibly lethal predator would be right back out in the dark jungle, smelling strongly of fermented fish sauce once again. Upon his highly anticipated official return to the United States, Major Coleman passionately wrote an incredibly detailed, highly urgent strategic report, heavily documenting absolutely everything he had personally witnessed. He meticulously described the bizarre biological disarming technique, the incredibly highly effective use of indigenous supernatural trackers, the terrifying danger, close artillery doctrine, and the incredibly profound philosophy of extremely long-range light infantry patrolling. He strongly, passionately recommended that the massive United States Army immediately study these brilliant Australian tactical methods and rapidly integrate them completely into their very own deeply classified special operations training programs. But the highly arrogant, deeply entrenched military bureaucracy inside the massive Pentagon was absolutely not intellectually ready to humbly listen to this profound tactical truth. The highly critical, deeply insightful document was immediately and intentionally buried incredibly deep inside the dusty military archives. It was officially dismissed using a completely pathetic bureaucratic excuse claiming the unconventional methods were entirely inconsistent with established intelligence gathering procedures. The absolute real historical reason was simply massive institutional pride. Admitting that a tiny handful of dirty Australians knew vastly more about jungle warfare than the entire American military was an incredibly bitter pill. The incredibly bloody war tragically dragged on for several more devastating years, ultimately costing thousands of entirely unnecessary human lives. But profound tactical truth genuinely always has a resilient way of finally resurfacing, even if it incredibly takes an entire decade to happen. In the year 1977, highly visionary Colonel Charles Beckwith was officially tasked with secretly creating an entirely new, incredibly elite counterterrorism unit for the military, eventually known universally as Delta Force. Beckwith intimately knew the old conventional military ways had entirely failed, actively searching for highly radical new training methodologies for his incredibly lethal operators. While aggressively digging directly through the massive Pentagon archives, he miraculously stumbled directly upon the entirely forgotten, incredibly dusty classified report originally written by Major Coleman. He rapidly read the highly detailed document once, and then he intensely read it entirely again. The highly experienced colonel instantly profoundly realized that this incredibly bizarre operational philosophy was exactly the critical missing strategic link. He immediately forcefully picked up his secure telephone and directly called Australia. For the absolute next 3 entire years, highly experienced, deeply hardened combat veterans of the legendary Australian regiment were highly quietly brought entirely to America. These incredibly tough foreign veterans served as highly respected primary instructors at the incredibly grueling Delta Force selection training course. They meticulously taught the elite Americans the absolute exact terrifying skills that had been completely arrogantly mocked an entire decade earlier. They aggressively taught them exactly how to perfectly move in absolute total biological silence. They strictly taught them exactly how to weaponize the natural environment, utilizing human smell and ambient sound as highly lethal tactical weapons. The foundational combat curriculum of Delta Force completely absorbed the highly unique, incredibly resilient biological DNA of those 5 dirty Australian soldiers. In the year 1983, long after the heavy tropical guns had finally fallen entirely silent, a highly reflective, fully retired Richard Coleman quietly traveled entirely to remote Australia. He officially arrived casually as a standard tourist, but his highly personal, deeply emotional true mission was to actively find the quiet veteran who had effectively taught him the absolute most important philosophical lesson of his life. He successfully found Terry O'Brien living incredibly quietly on a massive, entirely remote cattle station located deep in the harsh, extremely unforgiving natural landscape of the incredibly vast rural Queensland outback. The highly weathered former sergeant rarely verbally spoke about the deeply traumatizing war, but he warmly opened his quiet door for the highly respectful American. Sitting together late into the dark night, Coleman finally asked about the incredibly cryptic operational philosophy regarding letting the enemy actively find them. O'Brien took a slow sip of his cold drink and calmly explained that the heavily armed Americans wrongly fought the jungle as a purely mechanical engineering problem to be violently solved with massive firepower. The absolute profound truth was that the harsh natural environment was simply a highly dangerous reality to endure. The incredibly wise Australian calmly explained that you absolutely could never mechanically defeat the deeply ancient natural environment. You could only genuinely survive it by completely biologically integrating. To successfully become the absolute apex predator, you first had to be completely willing to humbly live exactly like the highly vulnerable prey. Major Coleman profoundly realized that 5 incredibly dirty men completely reeking of putrid fish sauce had definitively proven that deep humility is vastly deadlier than massive technological arrogance. When he had arrogantly called them filthy amateurs, he was genuinely looking directly at the terrifying future of modern warfare.